the flagship event of IBS Hyderabad. It is my privilege and honor to introduce Dr. Nupur Pavan Bang to you all. Dr. Nupur Pavan is the Associate Director at the Thomas Schmidheiny Center for Family Enterprise, Indian School of Business. She specializes in family business and finance. She has taught courses in family business, finance, accounting, and insurance at Premier B schools in India and globally. Dr. Nupur is a renowned thought leader in family business and is a frequent speaker at industry forums on issues related to family governance, family office, and the role of women in family business. She is an astute observer of families in family businesses and has interacted with several of them to understand their challenges, strengths, and best practices. She has authored several research papers, case studies, white papers, and articles for international and Indian publications. Previously, Dr. Nupur worked as the head of analytics at the Insurance Information Bureau of India, IIBI, an initiative by the insurance regulator IRDAI. Her previous engagement was also as an associate professor with IBS Hyderabad, and she has worked as an auditor in Singapore. She is a postdoc fellow from ISB, holds a PhD in finance, and is a fellow of the Association of Certified Chartered Accountants, ACCA of UK. She was listed among the top 100 women in finance in India in the year 2020. Dr. Nupur is going to deliver her talk on the title Share Pledging and its Consequences today. Dr. Nupur, I would like to welcome you on behalf of the entire department and ICBF, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Naseem. Good morning, everyone. I'm not sure how many of you know, but ICBF 2006 and ICBF 2008, where you had we had collaborations with the Bentley College and Philadelphia College. I was an integral part of organizing those two conferences. So it's really, I don't feel like someone who's a speaker here. In a way, I just feel like an extended organizer. So it's kind of a homecoming for me to ICBF. So thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm also a PhD from IFHE. So it's an honor to be back to IFHE and speaking in front of all of you, because whatever I am today, it's because of the foundation which IFHE has given me. Yesterday, I was not able to attend the felicitation ceremony for Dr. Reddy because I had another engagement at that time. But I would also like to start by taking the opportunity to thank him and to say that he has a very, very big role in shaping me and shaping the human being that I am today. I'm not even going to the scholarship part because all of us have benefited from his guidance in becoming good scholars. But even as a human being, he has had a very, very big part in shaping me. So thank you so much for attending this talk today. Let me just begin by sharing my screen. I don't have too much really in terms of I don't believe too much in PowerPoints, but I will still take advantage of them just to keep you all rooted. Now, I'm just going to put the logos of a few companies in front of you, and I realize that this is not an interactive session initially. Maybe later on we'll open the floor to Q&A, but in your mind, just think, what is common between these companies? These are all brands, or these are all companies that you recognize. These are all some of the gems that India has, very well-known brands. At the same time, these are companies which are all family-owned. These are all companies which have pledged the shares of their company. The promoters of these companies have pledged their shares. Somehow in the media, when you think about pledging or when you read about pledging, you think of only negatives. You only think of a Jet Airways, you only think of Reliance Dhirubhai Ambani Group, you only think of a Cafe Coffee Day. But even companies like the Tata Group, Imami, Asian Paints, Apollo Group, which have done very, very well, which are quite well governed, these companies have also utilized pledging. Now, this brings me to the topic for today, share pledging and its consequences, a study of Indian firms. This is a paper which is in advanced stages of going to a journal right now. So I'm not going to be presenting all the results. I'm only presenting the preliminary analysis, but I hope that is good enough to give you all a food for thought and to look at this phenomena more closely as scholars, as researchers in the area of finance. When we think about pledging really came into the limelight during the Satyam scandal in the year 2008-2009, when Ramalingam Raju disclosed to his board that he had pledged almost all shares of Satyam, and the money from that pledged shares he had diverted it to a sister concern, Metas. So there was an uproar, there was a corporate governance scandal at that time. As a result, SEBI came into action, and within 7 days, SEBI regulated that all companies where promoters have pledged their shares must disclose it to the regulator within a stipulated period of time. And now this begs a question: if pledging is so bad, as a lot of times regulators, in fact, RBI has warned time and again that pledging can become a systemic issue. SEBI keeps warning that pledge with responsibility, and pledging is a big risk. The media portrays pledging as a very, very negative phenomena. The stock price reaction to any pledging action is always negative. So if pledging is such a negative phenomenon, why is it that so many companies use it? In fact, if you see the graph here, close to a quarter of all NSE listed companies have pledged their shares. Promoters of at least a quarter of NSE listed firms have pledged their shares to some degree or the other. In fact, the average share pledging by promoters is close to 44%, and that's staggering by any accounts. 44% of all promoter shareholding is pledged on NSE listed firms. So there is a constant fear of loss of control, just like Naresh Goyal lost control of Jet Airways, just like Subhash Chandra lost control of Z Entertainment. So there are these constant news that promoters are losing control of their companies because they had pledged their shares. There is a negative narrative in the media. However, it remains a very popular phenomenon. And that's what piqued our interest in this topic. That can it be all bad? If it is so bad, we are talking about promoters like Subhash Chandra, Naresh Goyal, we're talking about the Tata Group, we're talking about the Apollo Group, and these promoters are very smart people. They have run billions of rupees of empire. So are they, wouldn't they have done their due diligence? Why would they use pledging if it was all bad? And we realized that the research in this context is quite sparse. In fact, the two papers in the Indian context on pledging is by our ICFAI PhDs, Yogesh Chauhan and Rajnikant Rajhans, who are I think Yogesh is in IIM Raipur and Rajnikant is in NICMAR right now. However, we are looking at it, this phenomena from a slightly different angle, not exactly what they are doing. But overall, the research around this area is quite sparse. So we had this phenomena of pledging coming into the limelight during Satyam, and Satyam was listed on both India and the New York Stock Exchange. Ramalingam Raju had pledged all of his shareholding in Satyam. And to top it, Satyam had just received the Golden Globe Awards for corporate governance in that year, in the preceding year. So it made it even more, it was a laughing stock at that time. Now, the state of pledging in India, as I said, that the average percentage of pledging amongst all listed companies is close to 7%. But when we look at only companies where there is some pledging that has happened, it's close to 44%. Firms with excessive pledging, that is firms where the pledging is probably more than 75%. That's also pretty high at around 7%, and it's going up, it's on the rise. Our source of our data is Prime Database, the Pledgers database, and we have data from the year 2009 to 2019. But why are we studying pledging in the context of family firms? Why not all firms? So firstly, 91% of all listed firms in India are family firms. And all the brands that you saw earlier, Tata's, Apollo, Jet, and GMR, Imami, they're all family-owned firms, and most of them are family-run as well. The average promoter shareholding in India is pretty high. It's greater than 50%, which means that a lot of the investors actually invest in those companies, not just looking at the company, but also looking at the promoters. The promoters have very, very high socio-emotional wealth attached to the firm. It has very, very high, the diversification of their own wealth is pretty low. Their wealth is concentrated in their own companies. So they are pretty scared of losing control of their companies. The promoters have traditionally used money raised from pledging for a variety of purposes. So some of them increase, they pledge their shares when the stock market is doing well, but they believe that the market will go up further, or the stock price will go up further. So they use the money from pledging of shares to buy back more of their own shares. They fund other group companies like Satyam did. So in case of Ramalingam Raju, he pledged the shares of Satyam and diverted that money to Metas. Similar thing happened in the case of Zee. Also, Subhash Chandra pledged the shares of Zee Entertainment to pump money into other loss-making enterprises that needed money. You fund short-term working capital requirements if you don't have enough working capital limits from banks, or it's not getting extended. You might pledge your shares to finance takeover by group companies or takeovers by same company also. For example, Granules India pledged their shares to actually acquire another company. You might, promoters might pledge the shares of their company for a marriage, for educational purposes, or for any other personal reasons. So the end use of pledging has become a hot button issue. In fact, SEBI says that promoters must disclose the end use of the funds, but it's not really being followed up, or it's not being implemented in spirit right now. In a falling market, in fact, the way pledging works is pretty much like financial derivatives. The mark to market or the margin call system of financial derivatives. So in a falling market, the lender or the financial institution can actually invoke the pledge and sell off shares in the market to recoup their lending if the margin calls are not met. This can lead to a downward spiral of share prices, because when the financial institution sells off shares in the market, it actually adds to the supply of those shares. And it also signals that the promoters have not been able to meet the margin call. That hurts small investors. So the popular press has criticized pledging as a risky route to financing. The practitioners and press say that the market reacts negatively, but there is scarce empirical evidence on this issue. So as I said, this really works like the way financial derivatives do, that when the share price is falling, the shareholder or the promoter gets a margin call. So in the first situation, the promoter can top up the collateral with shares or cash and continues to own the shares. In the second situation, the promoter does not respond to the margin call either because they don't have any more shares to give as collateral, or they don't have further cash to serve the margin call. In that case, the lender sells the pledged shares in the market. When we actually study companies in detail, we actually find contradictory anecdotal evidence. So as I said, that there are so many companies which are supposedly quite well governed, and 25% of all NSE listed companies have pledged some part of their shares or the other. So why would they do that if pledging was such a bad thing? So there is contradictory anecdotal evidence, and it suggests that there must be something good in it, that promoters are actually using it. So what we want to study is what are the implications of pledging on different types of firms in India, because as I said, for family firms, the skin in the game is quite high. They own greater than 50%, on an average greater than 50% of shareholding in their own firms, versus the non-family firms where the skin in the game is not so much and it is run more by professionals. What are the consequences of pledging in terms of value creation, profitability, risk, and control? And do heterogeneous family firms face different consequences? For example, a standalone family firm versus a family business group firm. So a family business group firm is a group of firms, for example, a Reliance group or a GMR group, or for that matter, the Z group, where the other group firms might need funds and to pump the internal capital markets or to keep the internal capital markets of the group flowing, the promoters may pledge shares in a well-performing company to serve or to direct the funds to a company which is not performing so well, or it needs funds for various reasons. So is there heterogeneity in the consequences when we look at different types of firms? Our data is for all NSE listed firms. It consists of 1,492 firms from the year 2009 to 2019. The data on pledging has been taken from Prime database, but the other financial information has been taken from Provis. We have matched the listed firms in India with the family and non-family classification that has been created by the Thomas Schmidheim Center for Family Enterprise. The base paper that we are following is Dow et al. 2019 that has been published in Journal of Financial Economics. We do an event study and also OLS regression. It's we do a combination to come to our conclusions. We look at a combination of large sample study as well as case studies. So I'm not going to get into the details of methodology and the details of data. What I'm going to come to directly is our findings so that we can spend more time in the discussions. So in the short term, we find that there is definitely a negative and significant reaction in family firms when shares are pledged. The reaction is even higher and negative when there is a forced sale of shares by financial institution. And there is no counter positive reaction when share pledge is released, or when the promoters are able to pay back and get their shares back. There is no positive reaction then. But for non-family firms, we find that in the short run, the reaction to pledging is insignificant. There is significant negative abnormal returns in the event that financial institutions invoke the pledge. That is when non-family firms are not able to meet margin calls and financial institutions have to sell the shares in the market. At that time, there is a significant and negative abnormal returns. Otherwise, in the short run, non-family firms have insignificant reaction to a share pledge. In the long run, there is a negative relationship with firms Tobin Q across all categories of firms: family, non-family, family business group firms, standalone family firms, all of them. There's a negative and significant reaction. The negative relationship strengthens when the promoter shareholding is greater than 75%, which means that the market realizes that there is a high risk of promoters losing control over the company, and hence the reaction is even greater. It also signals a greater distress within the promoter group, within the firm, and that's why the reaction is much, much more negative. Non-promoter investments on an average view pledge as an event that sends negative signals. To look at the risks that that pledging actually entails, we look at different types of risks. One is crash risk, which is we measure crash risk in terms of value at risk. What is the expected shortfall and what are the tail risks? And these are risks that are measured in the Dow et al. Paper. So we just follow that. And we find that there is a higher crash risk, higher tail risk, higher expected shortfall for both standalone family firms as well as family business group firms. But it is insignificant. It is actually, the sign is positive, but it is insignificant for non-family firms. In terms of risk aversion, do these companies which pledge their shares, do they become more risk averse? Because the promoters have a incentive to make sure that they don't take risky decisions, and to make sure that their earnings are pretty predictable, to make sure that there aren't too many fluctuations in earnings, the share price doesn't fluctuate. So do they become risk averse? Yes, they do become risk averse. There are lower investments in terms of R&D, CapEx, and assets. And it is more so in family business group firms when compared to standalone family firms. And we believe that is because in family business group firms, there is more, the literature in finance, in the business group literature in finance says that business groups or larger firms are more tracked by analysts. So the reaction in any earning fluctuation, stock price reaction to any earning fluctuation will be greater in family business group firms. And that's why probably the risk aversion to any such decision which will result in a significant change in earnings is more in family business group firms. And there is insignificant relationship in non-family firms. In terms of performance, so while we look at Tobin's Q for our stock market reaction during the event study, for long-term performance, we look at the return on assets, and we find that there is a negative relationship between firm performance and pledging amongst family firms. So family firms which have pledged their shares generally do not perform as well as firms which don't pledge their shares. And it is insignificant for non-family firms. Some of the very, very, very interesting findings that I'm going to show you in terms of graphical. It's said that a graph speaks more than any number of words. So if you see the graph on the top corner of my slide, you will see that most of the family firms actually have their shareholding above 50%. Now, so it is quite skewed towards the right-hand side. We have a lot of firms where shareholding is more than 50%. What if these firms where the shares are pledged, what if they lose their entire shareholding that they have pledged? So let's say a company, a promoter has 50% shareholding in a company and they have pledged 90% of their shares, which effectively means that they will be left with only 5% shareholding if they lose their 90% because of pledging, if they are not able to meet margin calls. What will happen if these promoters lose all that part of their shares which are pledged? You will get the graph on the bottom corner. And it is alarming to see that most of the promoters then will be left with very little shareholding. In fact, they will be left with close to 10-20% shareholding, and the number of firms with shareholding greater than 50% reduces significantly then. Now, please remember that India is basically dominated by family firms. A lot of us, even small investors, when we invest in a company, we look at the promoters. So we say, Bajaj mein invest kar lete hain, Tata mein invest kar lete hain, Ambani's mein invest kar lete hain. We know the promoters. We relate a company through its promoters. We believe in the promoters. Now, if the promoters themselves lose control of their shares, then a lot of the small shareholders, the retail shareholders, even institutional shareholders stand to lose a lot. However, as I said, you saw that in large sample analysis that we've done so far, we found that most of the results are negative. They signal a negative reaction, negative risks, negative in terms of performance, loss of control. So where is the positive? For the positives, we need to do a case-based analysis, and that's why we have used a combination of qualitative as well as quantitative analysis in this paper. And when we go into specific cases, for example, there are two cases that I show you here. One is on the left-hand side bottom, we have Asian Paints. On the right side, we have Apollo Hospitals. Both of them pledged, in both the companies, the promoters pledged their shares, but as you can see, the share prices have done very well. So both these companies pledged their shares, and they have used it as a legitimate entrepreneurial financing option or for strategic investments. For example, Apollo Hospitals used pledging for expansion, for growth, whereas Asian Paints used pledging to buy back their own shares. As I said, Granules India used share pledging to acquire another company in overseas market. These are all companies. Laurus Labs used pledging for expansion. These are companies which have used pledging as a strategic financing option, and they have done very, very well. So what is it that we take away from this kind of an analysis? The first thing is for the promoters themselves, the controlling shareholders. They need to beware of over-optimistic investment plans. So many a times these promoters, for example, Subhash Chandra, when they pledge their shares, they don't account for it that the share price can go down. They feel that it will always keep going up. They feel that their investments are always going to make money. So beware of over-optimistic investment plans and over-pledging. Have a limit that we will not pledge above 50% of our shares, or we will not pledge above 40% of our shares. Don't go ahead and stake everything on one investment plan. For minority shareholders, if you are investing in a family firm, and in India, there are high chances that most of us invest in family firms because they are just everywhere, and many of the large companies are also family firms. Please monitor the quantum of shares pledged and the reasons why those shares are being pledged. So the reason for pledging is very, very important because it gives a signal about the distress that the firm might be in, or if the money is being used for positive NPV projects, expansion, and so on. For the board of directors, they must act as stewards. They must caution controlling shareholders from over-pledging, and they have a fiduciary duty to shield the firm from suboptimal decision-making by owner-managers to manage margin calls and share price. So as I said, that promoters generally become risk-averse when they pledge the shares in the firm. So they shy away from making R&D expenditures. They shy away from making CapEx expenditures. It is the duty of the board of directors to caution the promoter, shareholders, and managers not to do that at the cost of not to do that to manage margin calls and share prices and at the cost of performance of the company. The regulators, for the regulators, there's a lot of corporate governance implications, and they realize it. That's the reason SEBI made it mandatory to disclose pledging of shares. However, the regulators must strengthen the board of directors and prevent rubber stamp boards. The RBI and SEBI must talk to each other, because RBI has data on the lenders who is lending against pledging to the companies, whereas SEBI has data on how much the promoters have pledged, and both of them are not talking to each other. So they must talk to each other to understand that which are the financial institutions which are lending to these promoters and to what extent. Introduce new regulations that discourage pledging for personal utility. For the family itself, the family must create awareness and build stronger family governance processes that would put checks and balances with regards to excessive pledging, because we believe, and this is just anecdotal, we don't have any empirical evidence to say this, but anecdotally, most of the family members may not even be aware that the family business leader or the person in charge is actually pledging so many shares, or the reasons why so much is being pledged. So there must be stronger family governance and checks and balances in place for over pledging. So what we realize is that yes, it is a very, very important phenomenon. It acts as a very good tool for entrepreneurial financing. However, there are a lot of negatives. The risks are very high. There is more nuanced studies needed. We cannot paint pledging as negative across the canvas. So there is a need for mix of large data analysis as well as case-based studies. This is the first, what I've presented to you is the first in a series of research papers and white papers that we at the center are taking up on pledging. And we believe that pledging is both good and bad. So pledging destroys value when family owners over pledge and are ill prepared with contingency plans. And then you have companies like Reliance, Z, and OYO, whereas pledging adds value when family owners use pledging to finance strategic projects and they face a credit crunch or lack of collateral availability. Then pledging can act as a very good financing tool. However, this is just one of the studies that we are doing, and you will see a series of studies from us coming in the future. I would like to now open the floor for Q&As if you have any. Just let me stop sharing. Yeah.
Great lecture, and a wonderful presentation. Thank you, Dr. Nupur.
Thank you, Naseem.
For a very well-crafted talk on an important topic. I'm sure the participants benefited immensely out of the talk.
Thank you.
You have touched upon a very important topic, so much so that RBI in its Financial Stability Report 2019 talked about the issue and the phenomenon of share pledging and how has this phenomena increased over the last 5-10 years. If there are any questions from the participants.
I see a question, Naseem. I see a question in the chat box.
Yes.
From
Kameshwar sir.
From Kameshwar sir. Do you think that it would make sense to investigate? Pledging is motivated by an ensuing distress. The promoters are using their insider information because there is no end monitoring, using this as an exit route. Absolutely, Kameshwar sir. We do have case studies, or we do know of companies where promoters have done this because they know that the company is not doing well, and if the share price is reasonably high, then they take this opportunity to sell off their shares. However, there is a lot of work going on even at the regulators' end to ensure that the monitoring of end use actually improves. But we know, as finance researchers and as chartered accountants, many of you here in this forum are chartered accountants, that basically relying on annual reports or relying on disclosures that are made by the company can sometimes actually they can, they may not really give the complete picture or the correct picture. As we saw even in Satyam case, that what was there in the annual report was actually fraudulent. So while regulators are putting in place, trying to put in place monitoring mechanisms and trying to ask for more disclosure, however, we have to be very, very cautious when we invest in companies which have very high pledging, and it makes sense to investigate this, but you have to think of where are you going to get the data for the motivation to pledge. Now, if you have that data, then it's a very good topic to investigate, because what we find in the data set that we have, we find that even companies which have disclosed the reason for pledging, it is quite vague, and we cannot really rely on it. Firstly, most of the companies actually don't disclose, and the companies that do disclose, many of them disclosures are quite vague as to the reasons or motivations for pledging. So yes, if you can find the data, it's a good topic to investigate. How do you define a family firm? So we define a family firm based on two mandatory factors. The first is that one family or family members should have at least 20% shareholding, mandatory shareholding in the company. And the second mandatory, criteria that we use is that one person, one or more people from the company should be on the board of directors, or someone from the company should be the CEO, managing director of the company. So it is ownership as well as management or governance of the company. They should be involved in it. If there is a lack of data about governance and management of the company, then we go to intention to pass on the shareholding to the next generation. Looking at these three criteria, ownership, management, and passing on the company to the next generation, we decide whether a firm is a family firm or not. And where do we get the data on date of pledging of shares and revocation of pledged shares? We use it from Prime database, but I do understand that there is some data in Provis as well. Do the companies disclose to stakeholders? This is by Jyoti, disclose to stakeholders where they are investing the amount got from pledging. Not always, Jyoti. A few companies which have good disclosure practices, they do disclose it either through their annual reports or through the media, but we don't have it for many of the companies. Yeah.
One question from my end, madam.
Yes.
Don't you think that share pledging as a phenomena, it sends a signal to the investing community that the promoters have already exhausted all other means of raising funds, either through debt or through, then that is why they are pledging their shares in order to get those funds. So this sends a signal, and that too in a falling market, which you talked about. Yes. It would lead to a selling pressure that would lead to further fall of this thing. So this information asymmetry, which is already there, is now getting exacerbated, and that is why this leads to. So what is your take on that?
Right. So yes, I totally agree with you that ideally it does send a signal that promoters have exhausted all means of financing, and therefore they're pledging their shares. However, when you actually go into specific case studies, we do find that there are companies which don't use it as the last option. They use it as a very, it's a tool where if they don't want to keep their house or they don't want to keep their factory as collateral, and if they are very confident about the share price, future share price of their own company, if they are very confident about the end use of this money that they are about to raise, then many a times they look at share pledging as a good tool to raise money rather than keeping something else as collateral. And please remember that if you look at family business literature, basically promoters actually don't want to dilute their equity. That is their last option. So while it may be possible for them to get private equity investment or to come up with a further public offering, but they try and avoid it because they don't want to dilute their shareholding. So if you look at the the hierarchy of the usage of funds or hierarchy of how they want to raise funds, then many of them actually would prefer to just pledge rather than go for dilution of equity. Or sometimes they may not want to keep their personal assets as collateral, and hence they are pledging the shares. Now, Padma Madam, the generation thing in family firms, how do we look at generation? And it's quite subjective. So it is not at all subjective actually, because firstly, our first two criteria, ownership and management, those are our main two criteria. If both of them are met, then we classify it as family firms. We go to the third one, generation, only if we don't have data on the second one, that is the management. So the first one is mandatory. If there is less than 20% ownership, then we don't even try and look for generation or management and all that. But once the first criteria is fulfilled, we go to the second one, that is management. And if that information is not available, so that actually filters down the number of firms where we need to look for generation. So it becomes less than 5% of the firms. We have to actually manually go and look if the company is being passed on from generation to generation. So you would see, for example, Dabur, Tatas, Tatas, if you see, none of the Tata Group companies or most of the Tata Group companies don't have a family CEO or chairman or managing director. They are all run by professionals. Similarly, if you look at Dabur Group of companies, none of the group companies have family members running the show. But when you go to their websites, and when you go to the group company, you know clearly that the company is being passed on from generation to generation. So it's not subjective. It's just that we have lesser number of companies to investigate like that. Hence, we can do a very thorough check, going through the websites, going through shareholding information, going through the holding company structure and seeing who are the shareholders. Is it the next gender that has been brought in, and so on.
Let me read out the question for you, madam.
Satish, please keep a tab on time and let me know when I should stop taking questions.
Madam, you can take questions. I think people are really interested in the talk. They in case you have time, ma'am.
No, I have time. It's a Saturday, okay, not a problem. But stop me when you have to stop me. Okay?
Right, ma'am.
So I have another question from Manish, who says that my question is related to share pledging by foreign companies. Request to put some light on share pledging, the scenario in developed countries like the US. So Manish, it is perfectly legal in countries like US and UK. However, it is not very popular, mainly because in countries especially in the US, concentrated shareholding is not the norm, and it is not as prevalent as it is in India. So pledging of shares mostly happens by insiders like directors of the companies and top management teams of the companies. But it does not pose systemic risk to those countries. However, it is perfectly legal even in those countries, and there are almost equivalent disclosure requirements even in those countries. It is more popular in countries like Taiwan and China, which perhaps have more family firms the way India has.
Madam, one question from an audience is, are there any studies relating to the effect on the employees of these companies that pledge the shares?
No, really, there is no there is no such study which looks at the effect on the employees, and that will have to be a case-based analysis only, because those of you who are aware of databases available in the Indian context even getting number of employees of a firm is a big deal. We don't even have good data for that. So forget about having to know how does it affect employees. It's a very difficult thing to get. There is another question that I have is about shareholder activism. How can the proxy firms play a role in making pledging effective? And that's an excellent question. This is something which is now very, very pertinent in the case of pledging. In fact, I would say in Satyam case also, pledging came into the limelight, or the fraud came into the limelight because Satyam was listed on New York Stock Exchange, and shareholder activism there actually brought the show down for Ramalingam Raju. Shareholder activism is on the rise in India, and it will definitely bring in better governance practices in India too. So you can already see cases where reappointment of CEOs is getting blocked. You can already see cases where the institutional investors are demanding more clarity and demanding more transparency. So yes, we do hope that even pledging scenario will become more responsible going forward. And remember, it's a perfectly legitimate way of raising funds. So SEBI cannot ban it. However, promoters just have to use it in a more responsible manner, because it's not just the promoters losing control of their company or losing money. There are a lot of other investors, employees, whose future is at stake and money is at stake in these companies. Where do you get the comprehensive list of all family firms in India? So basically, we get the list of all listed companies, or even if you want unlisted companies, from Provis. And then we do the classification for family, non-family on our own at the center. And the criteria I just mentioned, it's based on ownership, management, and passing on the company from generation to generation.
Ma'am, there's one question in between asked by Commissioner, sir. Madam, if the money is reinvested, then technically should we consider it as equity or debt?
So, consider it equity or debt for whom? So basically the company who's, where are you investing this money? So if you are investing this money in the same company, you've pledged your shares and you are investing this money in the same company, then it is, you're taking debt from the promoters. And if you're investing this money in another company, then you can invest it either in the form of equity or debt, because if you're investing it in another company, you're basically using it as personal, for personal utility. So the shareholders of this company, for example, Z Entertainment, when Subhash Chandra pledged the shares of Z Entertainment and he's putting that money in some other company, so Z Entertainment people don't care. For them, Subhash Chandra has pledged the shares of Z Entertainment and taken the money. Where he puts it, how he puts it, what he does with it, that is Subhash Chandra's prerogative, because the shares are like any other collateral. It can be a house, it can be a car, it can be shares. So it is just like any other collateral. You can use that money and put it in any other company, either as equity or debt. But if you're putting it in the same company, then you're plowing it in as debt. Unless you're buying back shares of your company, then you're basically, you're buying back the shares, and the adjustment in the balance sheet happens against the share capital.
Do we have more questions from the participants? Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am, for taking this time out of your busy schedule and accepting our invitation to deliver this talk. And
thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for your presence here.
Thank you, madam, for your wonderful presentation and gracing this event. You talked about a less talked about aspect of share pledging. It usually gets a bad rep in the popular media, and you showed us an alternate way of looking at it when companies use share pledging as a tool to raise funds for strategic financing. I thank you once again on behalf of the entire department and ICBF for gracing this event. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you,
Thank you.
Dr. Nupur. It's always been very nice listening to you for the clarity what you get when you speak, and also for the insights what you bring. It's a very interesting topic, and I do hope that you have a lot of policy implications, especially in terms of the reasons for, I think the promoter should try to give the reasons for, pledging their shares if it is not already done. And another one is, apart from the case approach, you could perhaps, if they give us what are the reasons for it, you can control for the performance of the companies and see, as to, how this has been affecting based on different reasons. Maybe, it might be for, buying back, or it might be for, non-productive use or personal use. Then perhaps you could see, how the shareholders are, reacting, having control for the performance of the company, apart from the case methods which you are anyway using. Thank you very much. And I do hope that, all our participants have got a lot of clarity on how to do a proper research. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.